About a year ago, Wade Davis had met me at the Christmas craft fair. And he came up to me, introduced himself, and said, I was selling memberships and talking about the museum and archives, the revitalization project. And so he introduced himself. Hi, I'm Wade Davis, and I'd really like to help you out any way I can, and perhaps do an event and speak for you. And I said, nice to meet you, and would you like to buy a membership? And I didn't really clue in to who he really was.
But I bought a membership.
So 9 months later, here we are, and once again, clearly I don't know who he is, because when we were selling tickets, we sold out in 2 weeks, and people kept on coming up to me and saying, why didn't you have this over 2 nights? Don't you know who Wade Davis is? Oh, well, I'm sorry, but, and this is, how come you only charge $15? You could have doubled that. Don't you know who Wade Davis is? And it really went on and on. So anyways, I've done a little research, and I'll tell you who Wade Davis is. Anyways, but one of the things I should say, first of all, is that why Wade Davis really wanted to support us is because every community really needs a repository to collect artifacts and archival materials. It's great for researching, not just for the researchers who are writers and that kind of thing, but also for the general public, learning about their history. There's no better person than Wade Davis for appreciating the importance of an archives, and because many of his writings were based on research. So he had appreciation for that. So on to who Wade Davis is. Wade Davis, named by the National Geographical Society as one of the explorers for the millennium. He has been described as a rare combination of scientist, scholar, poet, and passionate defender of all of life's diversity. And I'm going to go through a list of some of these of his achievements, and you'll see why he receives these kind of accolades. He holds degrees in anthropology and biology, and received his PhD in ethnobotany, all from Harvard University. Wade Davis is professor of anthropology and the BC Leadership Chair in Cultures and Ecosystems at Risk at the University of British Columbia. Between 1999 and 2013, he served as explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society and is currently a member of the National Geographic Society's Explorers Council. He's an author of 20 books, including The Serpent and the Rainbow, One River, The Wayfinders, and The Sacred Headwaters. His many film credits, you do have a few film credits, I'm sure. His many film credits include Light at the Edge of the World, and 8-hour documentary series written and produced for the National Geographic. Davis is the recipient of 11 honorary degrees, as well as numerous medals for the highest level of achievement from various organizations. And the list is very long, but the medals, some of the medals, where he got them from were the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, the Explorers Club, the Royal Geographical Society, as well as Harvard University. A very long list. His books have appeared in 19 languages and sold more than 1 million copies. Into the Silence, The Great War, Mallory, and the Conquest of Everest received the 2012 Samuel Johnson Prize. This is the top award for literary nonfiction in the English language. Just recently, in 2016, Wade Davis has been made a member of the Order of Canada. So on the eve of Remembrance Day, it is fitting we have a presentation on Into the Silence, taking us through the carnage of the trenches to the desire of redemption at the top of the world. Please give a warm welcome to a fellow Bowen Islander, Wade Davis.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. And, it's really my real pleasure to help out the archive. History is the foundation of who we are. And it's also wonderful to be here, with all of you who, so many of you I know, and so many of you have welcomed my wife, Gail, and I when we moved to Bowen Island just a couple years ago. And we've never regretted it. We just love being in this community. So it's wonderful to be able to be with you all tonight, especially on the eve of Remembrance Day. Everything, literally everything you know about your life, every sense you have of being modern, every existential doubt or neurotic affliction was born of the mud and blood of Flanders. Darwin, Freud, Einstein were men of the 19th century, but their radical ideas that species were mutable, that you don't control the sanctity of your own thoughts, that the apple doesn't fall quite as Newton said it did, all of those ideas found fruition in the 20th century, literally as if they had been sown in soil fertilized by the dead. The same can be said for the music of jazz, the writing of James Joyce, the art of Dali and Cocteau. The war was the fulcrum of modernity. For a century, Europe had been at peace, even as industrial miracles created wealth and military power unlike anything that had ever been known. And the European powers had sliced up the corners of the globe until the borders of imperial ambitions met and clashed, and then a single bullet fired into the neck of a prince in Sarajevo set off the greatest cataclysm in the history of humanity. And with it died a world of optimism, faith, hope, certainty. The Second World War was but the child of the first. Churchill famously called the two wars the 30 Years' War, and he said that never was there a war less necessary to fight than the first, or more essential to win than the second. And so the Great War, which we remember in its centenary tonight, was really the fulcrum upon everything changed, and modernity as we know it was born. And it's certainly the backdrop of this particular story I'll share with you tonight. And then the genesis of this particular story began rather innocently in the spring of 1996 when I traveled 6,000 kilometers from Chengdu in western China to Lhasa and Kathmandu in that same fateful spring where the debacle happened on Mount Everest that John Krakauer so powerfully chronicled in his book Into Thin Air. And the leader of our ecological survey, it was one of the great scams of my life. We just made up the name, the Sino-American Ecological Survey, which gave us the ability to get permits to go to places that no scientists had been since the Chinese Revolution. But leading that sleight of hand was a good friend of mine, Dan Taylor, who was the son and grandson of medical missionaries in the Himalaya. His father had been a very good friend of Howard Somerville, who was Mallory's closest friend on the mountain. And Dan, in particular, had been nursed on the stories of those early British efforts to climb Everest in the 1920s, and that was the Everest of his imaginings, not the sordid commercial scene of today. And he was particularly offended that the commercialization of Everest had resulted in such unnecessary loss of life. Well, the very next fall, Daniel and I found ourselves on the east face of Everest, the legendary Kanchung face, trying to photograph snow leopards for the National Geographic. And we got caught in unusual seasonal conditions. We actually thought we might get trapped in the Gama Valley for the winter. And Daniel, in his inimitable way, began to speak of these Englishmen dressed in tweeds who flung themselves against the ice of Everest and read Shakespeare to each other at 23,000 feet. And as an Anglophile, I was immediately hooked. Now, the basic story, as Rob intimated, was that England and Britain, having lost the race to the North and South Poles, set out to climb Everest, which loomed over the Raj. Everest, which loomed over the Raj, kind of emerged as the third pole and the symbol of the possibility of British ascendancy. And so in 1921, they set out to find it, walking 400 miles off the map to come to close quarters with a mountain that no European had approached. And in 1922 and 24, having found the chink in its armor, they set out to climb it. And then famously, on June 8th, 1924, George Mallory, the most famous climber in the British Empire, and his young companion, Sandy Irvine, a lad of but 22 from Cambridge, were last seen by Noel Odell, a climber in support, high on the northeast ridge, going strong for the top when the mist rolled in and enveloped their memory in myth. And neither man would be seen again alive. And the question that would haunt British mountaineering in particular for half a century would be, did they reach the top before meeting their end? But I, as I set out on this story, was never interested in that question. What interested me from the start was the spirit that had carried these men aloft. And why was it that on that fateful day they had kept going, knowing full well that perhaps they were walking to their death? And my sense from the very beginning, knowing the age and the class and the background of all of these men, was that perhaps having gone through the war when so many had died, for them life was precious but effervescent. And perhaps this explained their willingness to climb on, accepting a degree of risk that would have been unimaginable before the war. They weren't cavalier, but death was no stranger. They had seen so much of it that it had no hold on them. It had nothing more to teach them save that of their own. And perhaps this explained why they walked on, because what mattered in the wake of the war was how one lived. And so I set out to find out what had happened to all of the men on those expeditions during the war. Now, that may seem, given that there were 26 of them altogether, an impossible task. I wanted to find out where each man was every single day of the 4 years and the 4 months of the Great War, and to ascertain to the extent possible what they had been exposed to. Now, that may seem like an impossible task, and it was famously said of both the Battle of Passchendaele and the Somme that the British Army lacked the clerk power to tabulate the dead. But if that was true, they kept records of just about everything else. In fact, this war was so completely chronicled that it's a wonder that men found time to fight. And what's more, the British zone of operations was hauntingly small. At no point in that war was the British sector of the Western Front longer than 125 miles. For much of the war, it was 85 miles in length. Now, behind that frontage, the British forces, including the Canadians and the Australians and the Indian Army, would build 6,000 miles of railroad, 6,000 miles of trenches. In the salient around the medieval cloth town of Ypres, 4 miles by 12 miles in scale, an area that a man could walk around in a long day, 1.7 million boys would fall. Not only was the zone of operations so small, but so many millions of men moved through it. And in the wake of the war, there was a tsunami, a cathartic tsunami of literature that came out with 10 years of the peace. Journals, poetry, memoirs, letters. And as a result, it turned out that there was no point in that battlefield that hadn't been chronicled in multiple voices throughout the war, from the bombastic boasts of a Yorkshire sergeant to the haunting cries of a young subaltern, shattered in shell shock. And so it turned out that I was actually, by visiting 57 archives, both in Europe, North America, I was able to find out where all of these men had been every day, as I set out to do, and to ascertain with this level of specificity that would have haunted me before the project began, just what they were exposed to. And this journey through the archives was itself a kind of journey, to quote Siegfried Sassoon, as he tried to describe the horror of shell shock. It was a journey through a twilight memory of hell. At the outset of the war, a man needed to stand 5'8" in the Canadian Army, or the British Army, to be recruited. Within 2 months, men 5'3" were eagerly recruited. Cremation was unknown in Britain before the war. In the wake of the war, it was a preferred form of burial for countless tens of thousands who had lived 4 months and 4 years in the presence of rotting cadavers in no man's land. Plastic surgery was born of the war, and the need to repair the shell-scarred faces of young boys who would spend the rest of their lives behind wooden masks and attend special holiday camps where they could remove the masks and feel the wind on their gargoyle features without fear of shame or humiliation. The British Army would need 400 million battle dressings during the war and 22,386 artificial eyes. The regular British Army in the entire British Empire required 2,500 shovels. In the Western Front, 10 million would be required. 25,000 Welsh coal miners spent the entire war underground, ferreting beneath the German lines to detonate charges of TNT that blew with such percussive power that they could be felt the vibration on Hampstead Heath in London. And then there was the sound and stench of battle. At Waterloo, Wellington and Napoleon exchanged 20,000 cannon shot over 3 days. On the Western Front, it was not unusual for the two sides to exchange more than 1 million artillery shells in a 12-hour period. Bayonets, we have this image of the bayonet charge, the iconic image of the war. In fact, bayonets accounted for about 1/3 of 1% of morbidity on the front and mortality. 35% of boys who died did so from machine gun fire, rifle fire, but 65% simply died clinging to the mud wall of a trench as a rain of fire and metal fell from the sky. Artillery did the deed. In the entire history of the American debacle in Iraq and Afghanistan, not 10,000 soldiers have been killed. In World War I, the British Army every month needed 10,000 lieutenants alone to replace the litany of the dead. Most came from schools, and therefore Cambridge and Oxford did not accept a single youth during that war, and schools like Marlborough, Uppingham Academy, Charterhouse, where Mallory taught, Winchester, where he went to school, graduated their senior classes not to Oxbridge, but directly to the Western Front. France would lose 75,000 dead within 2 months in the first month of the war, 40,000 on 2 terrible days in August alone. So when the war ended, in Britain alone, there were nearly 1 million dead, 2.5 million wounded, 40,000 amputees, 60,000 men without sight, and 65,000 men who never recovered from the mental ravages of shell shock. Before the war, the total cost of managing the British Empire was £500,000 a day. The war cost £5 million a day and bled the nation economically. In the wake of the war, taxes and death duties alone provoked such economic agonies that between 1918 and 1921, more land would exchange hands in Britain than had done so since the Norman conquest. Women spoke about the war through the metaphor of dance. By the end of 1916, Diana Manners famously reported, every boy I had ever danced with was dead. Vera Brittain simply said that the war had left no one left to dance with. She had lost, of course, her brother, her fiancé, and her 2 best friends. The poet Stephen Spender remarked that the British middle class in the wake of the war continued to dance, unaware that the dance floor itself had fallen out from beneath them. And so if the quest for Mount Everest began before the war as a grand imperial gesture, as redemption for an empire of explorers who had lost the race to the North and South Poles, it ended up being a mission of regeneration for a nation bled white by the conflict. Of the 26 British climbers who, on the 3 expeditions, 1921, 22, and 24, walked 400 miles off the map to come to the base of Everest, 20, as it turned out, had seen the worst of the fighting. Now, 6 escaped the war. Sandy Irvine, too young. Beetham was a schoolmaster. Bullock was a diplomat. Longstaff, too old, sat out the war in India. But 20 saw the worst of the fighting. Jack Hazard, who in 1924 climbed to the summit of the North Col, did so with open, bleeding wounds contracted 8 years before at the Battle of the Somme, wounds that had never healed, still saturating his climbing tunic as he reached the crest of the North Col. 6 had been severely wounded in the war, 2 nearly killed by disease, 1, John Knoll, hospitalized twice for shell shock. He went to his death telling anyone who would listen about his heroics during the Great War. His own daughter, Sandra, until I told her gently, didn't know that, in fact, her father had spent the entire war in an asylum, shaking with shell shock. 2 lost brothers killed in action. All of them, 4 of them had been surgeons at the front, like my own grandfather, dealing every day with a litany of the dead. All of them had endured the slaughter, the coughing of the guns, the white faces of the dead, the bones and the barbed wire. In August of 1916, Geoffrey Winthrop Young, who was Mallory's mentor, the greatest climber of his own generation, recorded in his diary a list of good friends who had died. These were numbered 25. That left room for 25 acquaintances. Young had been at Ypres on April 22nd, 1915, when the Germans attacked using poison gas, chlorine gas, for the first time, and only the heroic defense of the 1st Canadian Division held the British line. And in fact, 2 of the names on our memorial in Snug Cove, 2 of the boys of the 5 boys of Bowen Island who died in that war, died in the wake of this chlorine gas attack at Ypres on 22nd of April, 1915. And this is what Geoffrey Winthrop Young wrote in his journal that night. He was a medical man. This horror was too monstrous to believe at first, but when it came, far as we had traveled from our civilized world of a few months back, the savagery of it, of the sight of men choking to death with yellow froth, lying on the floor and out on the fields, made me rage with an anger which no later cruelty of man, not even the degradation of our kind in the later concentration camps of Germany, ever quite rekindled. For then we still thought all men were human. Well, Young was the mentor of Mallory, and I found out that on the very day that Mallory and Irvine disappeared, Winthrop Young joined another party of British climbers, summiting a more modest peak in the Lake District, the Great Gable. This party was led by a Canadian, Arthur Wakefield, who had served on the 1922 expedition. He had been the first to reach the 7 Sherpas who had been swept away in the avalanche. And it was Geoffrey Winthrop Young's first climb since losing his leg to an Austrian shell on the Italian front. He climbed, supported by his beloved wife Len, in rains so fierce that they swept the cape from his back. They were there to dedicate a plaque to the Field and Rock Climbing Club of the Midlands, to the men who had perished in the war. Now, I knew that Arthur Wakefield was a devout religious man. He had been part of the Grenville mission in Newfoundland, in Labrador, before the war. And I knew from his son, who passed away during the course of my research, that something happened in the war that led him to lose all of his religious faith, and that fascinated me. And I knew from journalistic reports of this moment that Arthur Wakefield had stepped forward to the memorial plaque, slowly pulled back the Union Jack, saturated with rain, the same flag that had flown from the battleship Barnham at the at the Battle of Jutland, and he began to speak of the breath of the Moor and the spirit of self-sacrifice that had led all of them to go off to fight for king and country. And then, by all ocular accounts, he began to wail. Great sounds of grief that were heard all across the mountains of the Lake District. And then he stopped. And after that, his son said he would never show human emotion. Never again in his life, with his children or his grandchildren, would any of them see the inside of a church. And I became fascinated by that. What happened to this man, Wakefield? Well, I was able to ascertain from a letter he had written his wife, censored, but I knew that he'd been on the Grenville mission. I knew that he had personally funded the legendary First 500 of the Newfoundland Regiment. I knew that he had sailed from St. John's with them at the outbreak of hostilities. They got to Salisbury Plain. They peeled off to fight in Gallipoli. He was sent to a casualty clearing station in France. Now, these casualty clearing stations were really quite extraordinary places. These were just outside of artillery fire. And in battles that had 70% morbidity rates, with battalions of 1,200 men being supported but 16 stretcher parties, it meant that if you were wounded in battle, you basically had to crawl back to what remained of your trench, hope that you could find the aid station if it had not been obliterated by shell fire, and then hope that somebody would carry you or help you to get back to a casualty clearing station. There you went through a process of triage. If you were destined to die, a red cross was placed on your forehead. If there was any way that you could walk or be carried to one of the hospital trains, you were immediately evacuated to the French coast and eventually to Victoria Station in London, the gate of no return. But the attention of the 8 surgeons, 2 working to a 6-hour shift at those field hospitals, went to the boys that had to be operated on or they would die. And the pressure on those surgeons is incredible. There's an amazing story of Geoffrey Keynes, the brother of John Maynard Keynes, founder of modern economics. He's working in a dungeon that's been converted into a casualty clearing station on the mutilated genitalia of a young British private. He's dripping with sweat. He's only got the acetylene lamps to give him light. And as he's operating, he suddenly looks up and he sees a sovereign, King George V. He simply looks up to the king, utterly ignores him, and turns back to the task at hand. Well, I knew from a reference in a letter that Wakefield had sent to his beloved wife back in New Brunswick that on the eve of it referred to an architectural feature which told me he had been in Albert, which was the staging ground of the Somme, the greatest battle of the war, the greatest battle in the history of British arms. And I knew that the British weren't moving surgeons out of that zone of operations within a month of that attack. And I was later able to ascertain that he was, by complete chance, at a casualty clearing station right behind the front at Beaumont Hamel, where his beloved boys of Newfoundland, many of which he had literally brought into the world as one of 2 doctors in all of Labrador, were scheduled to attack on July 1st as part of the British 29th Division. And in the wake of that attack, I later was able to determine that he had wandered through the seas of wounded, trying to find anyone who spoke the lilt of the Newfoundland accent, trying to find anybody who had the blue puttees unique to the regiment, or the insignia of the golden caribou unique to the regiment. It was as if he realized the entire regiment had simply evaporated. And of course, the problem was that it had. As many of you know, the Newfoundland Regiment was ordered to attack at 9:15 on July 1st. They had no one on their right flank because the 1st Essex, scheduled to be there, had been slow getting to the frontage because of the sheer volume of dead. When they were ordered over the top as the second wave against Beaumont Hamel, shells landed on corpses and flying fragments of flesh blinded the living. Men enveloped in flames went mad and fought each other as they died. Men dropped dead at every yard, and when they finally, a few of them, reached the German trench line, They realized the artillery had completely failed, the trench line wasn't damaged at all, and the last thought of many of these brave boys of Newfoundland, breathless with exhaustion, blood-whipped and deranged with fear, was this horrid realization that the German line was unscathed. And so they simply spun into the wire and in fury tossed their grenades, their screams baffled by the throaty gurgle men's sound when hit in the brain. Altogether, 810 boys went over the top that day. Only 34 emerged unscathed. The British High Command said to the Premier of Newfoundland that it was a magnificent display of trained and disciplined valor, and its assault only failed of success because dead men cannot advance any further. Well, Wakefield wasn't the only surgeon. Howard Somerville, Mallory's closest friend on the mountain, was also a surgeon at the casualty clearance station. He was told to expect 1,000 casualties in the first week. Within hours of the attack, he walked out into a field where he found himself with one other surgeon surrounded by 6 acres of dying boys. He had to decide who would live and who would die. He would never come back from Everest. He became a medical missionary and devoted his entire life to saving the living, that he might sweep away all memories of the dead. And so, in the wake of the war, as Tom Longstaff laconically reported, the supply of young climbers was not what it was before the war. Geoffrey Winthrop Young used to bring all the climbers together at a place called Pennypaths in Wales, where by day they would climb and by night they would recite poetry and argue and dream new dreams of a new century where anything seemed to be possible before that horrible war, but of the beautiful and honed faces that you can see even today if you go to that old hotel at Pennypaths, of the men who climbed with Mallory for fun before the war. 23 would die, and 11 be so mutilated that, like Winthrop Young, they would struggle merely to walk. And so, in the wake of the war, who was going to go to Everest? And what indeed was Everest to the British? Because if the war had informed and haunted the lives of the men, these expeditions were not isolated adventures, but rather imperial gestures woven from the start into the fabric of the Raj. The British Raj was an extraordinary place. A fifth of humanity dominated by 1,300 individuals of the British civil service. Not a single Indian was in the civil service because, as Lord Curzon finally, the Viceroy famously reported, in all of the subcontinent there wasn't a single Indian up for the job. Mercantile zeal, severe military reprisals, a co-optation of local elites, all helped the British hold on to that territory, but what really held the Raj together was the sheer audacity of the effort, the sheer gall of a small island nation that never set out to rule the world, but did so with such flair. And the British had transformed the face of India, but at the same time, India was a British invention, an imagined place brought into reality by the surveyors of the Survey of India. Maps were the key to India. And so it shouldn't surprise us that the greatest scientific experiment of the 19th century, the experiment that led to the discovery of Mount Everest, was a literal physical measurement of the entire subcontinent of India. Geographers knew that the Earth was not a perfect sphere, but the degree of distortion was uncertain. So beginning in 1806, the Survey of India, with these massively sophisticated the greatest scientific instruments of the 19th century, these brass theodolites that weighed 1,200 and 1,400 pounds, had to be marched the length of the continent in this process of triangulation, which literally led to the physical measurement of a single line of longitude across the arc of all of India. And when they reached the Himalaya, they branched out east and west, and such was the wizardry of differential calculus and mathematics that they could literally look across the horizon and measure the height of the mountains that scored the skyline. And in 1856, it was determined simply with basic mathematics that this mountain that was on the horizon was, which later became known as Everest, named after the cantankerous head of the India Survey, a man so embittered that it's an irony of history that his real family name was Everest. And so he was condemned to have this mountain named after him, but mispronounced for all time. But the measurement of Everest, if you can believe it, in 1856 was only 28 feet off what we know it is today. These were extraordinary mathematicians, and by the way, they were not British, they were Indian. Now, this didn't really impress the British, predictably, because what they cared about was the world that lay beyond the mountains. Maps and knowledge were the key to the empire, and it drove the British crazy that they had no diplomatic relations with the Dalai Lama of Tibet. Because after all, Lhasa was only 200 miles beyond Darjeeling, which exported tea to every hamlet in Britain. And frustrated by this, the British eventually authorized in 1903 the invasion of Tibet by Sir Francis Younghusband. All that achieved was to get to Lhasa, show that the Russians were not, in fact, in Lhasa, and it destroyed the Tibetan army and awakened the wrath of China, setting in motion a series of sort of cataclysmic encounters between the Tibetans and the Chinese, which eventually, in 1909, led to the 13th Dalai Lama being forced into exile in Darjeeling, where he came into the arms of this extraordinary man by the name of Bell. And Bell was an incredible scholar, and he was also a great Tibetophile, and he was never again going to let the Tibetans be manipulated by the British. And so eventually, the permission to even attempt to go to Everest, given that Nepal was completely closed at the time, was a consequence of a complex diplomatic mission, which included an arms deal to the Tibetan government that would hopefully be the foundation of a free Tibet. And so it's important to realize that from the very start, these expeditions were not isolated as athletic events, but were absolutely enmeshed in British imperial policy. Now, in the immediate wake of the armistice, Younghusband, who had gone in 1903, kind of broken the virginity of Lhasa, the legendary city as he saw it. He had come back and he had seen on the skyline Everest, and this fired his imagination. He became obsessed with mounting an expedition to it. And of course, the war intervened, and then in 1919, he decided within a month of the armistice to rekindle the dream of Everest. And he brought to the podium at a joint meeting of the Alpine Club and the Royal Geographical Society this remarkable man, a pioneer of cinematography, John Noel, who in 1913 stained his skin with walnut juice, slipped into Tibet, and came closer to the mountain than anyone before him. And of course, Noel came to the podium, and he had spent the entire war in an asylum with shell shock. So as he came to the podium, he saluted those who had died in the war, who might have led an expedition to Everest, including a man called Rawlings, Cecil Rawlings, who had been dispatched from the Younghusband invasion to reconnoiter Everest. And they had planned to go before the war, but of course, Rawlings had died at Passchendaele, the blindest battle of a blind war, where in 3 months the British lost 400,000 casualties to advance the line 5 miles. At Passchendaele, 90,000 boys would be killed. 90,000 boys alone would be recovered, too mutilated to identify them, and 42,000, including Rawlings, would simply evaporate in a spray of red mist. And so there was this idea that we're going to go to Everest. It was kindled right after the armistice. It was this great sort of symbol of national pride. But the question was, who was left to go? So many had been wounded. So many had been killed. Well, of course, we knew that George Mallory, who was often said had an easy war, he didn't have an easy war. He spent 18 months at the front. But he would be one, the master of rock. But the obvious other character to go was this man on the right, George Finch, an Australian who was to ice and snow what Mallory was to rock. And they were scheduled to go. Their passage had been bought on the P&O liners to go to Mumbai. And then 2 weeks before they were to depart, the Everest committee ordered both men to undergo a medical examination. Mallory passed in flying colors. Finch failed and was kicked off the team. This provoked the first great scandal of Everest, because what had happened to Finch? 2 weeks later, having been kicked off the team, he went up to Cambridge and set world records for endurance in the oxygen deprivation tanks that Arthur Kellis had set up. That summer, while Mallory was reconnoitering Everest, he set records in the Alps. So what happened? Was he kicked off the team because he was an Australian? That could have happened with Arthur Hinks, this Svengali of the expedition, but it would have involved the duplicity of Sandy Wollaston, the team doctor and naturalist, a man that everybody said was incapable of duplicity. Well, I set out as part of my research to figure this out. Now, a lot of great research can be done in the archives, but the really juicy stuff is in the divorce court records in High Holborn Street. It turns out that events had taken a tangled turn in George Finch's life that would have left any man weak on the day of his examination. First of all, I looked at the examination of the Harley Street doctors, and it was purely superficial and subjective. They basically said his complexion is terrible, he hasn't been eating, he basically looks like shit. Well, events had taken a tangled turn in George's life that would have left any man looking somewhat weak. And it all began, I was able to determine, in the spring of 1915 at an officers' dance, when he had met a beautiful young actress, terribly coquettish, by the name of Betty Fisher. They had nothing in common, but that was enough, and they married, eloping, leaving their return address as no man's land. He shipped out eventually to fight in the Salonika front, where word reached him in early 1916 that his wife was dying. So securing compassionate leave, he went back to London to find Betty and found her not only not dying, but perfectly healthy, thank you very much, and the mother of a young boy that clearly was not of his blood. So we went off to France, found the cuckold, thrashed him to the point of death, barely escaped a court-martial, went back, and Betty pledged her infinite fidelity for a second time. He then returned to war, had her watched, and within months his worst fears were confirmed. But this didn't really bother him, because by this point he had fallen in love with a nurse by the name of Gladys May. And as soon as possible after the war, he returned to London to sever his relations with Betty, and his divorce came through on September 29th, 1920. But now he had a problem, because Gladys May was now pregnant with a child that clearly was of his blood. And so 5 weeks after his divorce, he married Gladys May. He had done the honorable thing, but the problem was he didn't love her anymore. He had fallen in love with a woman by the name of Agnes Bubbles Johnson. And so he tried to cut his ties with Gladys May, but the judge would have nothing of it. And on March 2nd, 1921, I was able to ascertain that a judge had ordered him to return home to the bed of Gladys May and render his proper duties. Finch, being a stubborn man, refused, and he set out 2 weeks later to do what a proper gentleman did in that era to escape an entanglement. He arranged, as I was able to determine, on the night of March 15th, 16th, and 17th, to commit very public adultery in room 477 of the Strand Hotel. And as intended, this left Gladys with a choice of two things, either enduring public humiliation or granting him his freedom. And so his second divorce came through on December 12, 1921, and within 2 weeks he married for a third time to Agnes Bubbles Johnson. His second wife, Gladys May, was simply expunged from the record. Now, it's not clear how much of that was known in the rarefied world of London to the Everest Committee, but one thing is very clear. On March 17, 1921, the very day he was examined by the Harley Street physicians, George Finch had a couple of things on his mind. 2 weeks previously, he had been ordered to return to the bed of a woman he disdained who was about to give birth to a child of his. Out of another disastrous relationship, he had inherited responsibility for a 4-year-old boy that bore his name but not his blood, a boy who would grow up to become the famous British actor Peter Finch. To get rid of his second wife, he had promised to pay her 100 quid a year, a significant sum for a scholar who had lost all his family money in the collapse of the Siberian Railroad after the Russian Revolution. And on the very day of the medical examination, he was scheduled to commit adultery with 3 prostitutes at the Strand Hotel in a contrived setup intended to free him to marry the woman of his dreams. So as I wrote in the book, it's no wonder that he had lost his appetite, or that, as the doctors reported, his complexion was sallow, his general appearance tired, his condition poor. So who does go to Everest? Now, if you look at these rather mousy individuals in Darjeeling in 1921, they don't exactly look like your classic mountaineer. On the far left, Sandy Wollaston, then George Mallory in the pith helmet, Guy Bullock, the diplomat with his pipe, the governor of Bengal, and then the incredible Colonel Howard Bury and the irascible Scot Harold Rayburn. Well, let me just tell you how mousy these men were. In 1905, Sandy Wollaston saw an advertisement in the London Times seeking a naturalist for a botanical expedition in Uganda, in the mountains of heaven. He left the next day, traveled 3 months, spent 8 months with Rothschild in the jungles of Uganda, and when the expedition came to an end, he thought, why go back the same way? And so he walked from the source of the Congo to the mouth, becoming the second man to do it since Stanley. In 1909, he joined none other than Cecil Rawling on a birding expedition to New Guinea and decided he'd climb the highest mountain in New Guinea. And to do so, he brought with him 6 naturalists, along with 60 convicts, 40 Javanese soldiers. He bought 220 Dayak headhunters from Borneo, and he had scores of English porters. He led them all into the jungle, and they all promptly died. And there's a lunatic scene in his journal where there's only one other white guy still alive, well, 2. One died of malaria, and one having dinner with him on a crate of the expedition, as the river is literally rising at their knees in flood. And he says in his journal, it was a dark night, but there was one bright light. It wasn't going to be too difficult to wash our dishes that night. You know, this is really true. You can't make this up. Now, if we go over here to Howard Bury, in 1905, he had stained his face with walnut juice, slipped into disguise into Tibet. He once anointed himself with oils and naked walked the length of the Ganga, killing a man-eating tiger that had run off with 22 holy men. He had fought throughout the war. In his journeys in the central Kashmir and Karakoram, he befriended a bear that he called Agu. And he carried this bear on the pommel of his saddle for 6 months and brought him back to his estate in Belvedere in Ireland. And as bears do, Agu got very big. And his favorite form of exercise was to strip himself naked and wrestle with Agu beneath the willow arbor of his estate on Belvedere. He had fought throughout the war. It's a miracle he survived. He only went mad once, and that was at Devil's Wood, where 4,000 boys had died that afternoon. And he and his men were ordered to dig a communication trench, and they found themselves digging not through the chalk soils of Picardy, but through 6 feet of rotten corpses of the dead of earlier battles. He led the 1921 reconnaissance. He was a beautiful writer, and as they approached their base in Tingri, he saw in the distance on their road a Mongolian pilgrim rising and falling with the kind of rhythm of a metronome, and he realized that this was a Buddhist pilgrim moving one body length at a time in ritual prostration from Kathmandu from Lhasa to Kathmandu, and it was an astonishing kind of symbol of religious possibility to him. And as he moved past on his pony, he could hear, he wrote, the sand beneath the hands of the pilgrim, and then he suddenly looked to the left, and for the first time he saw the summit of Everest scoring the sky to the south. And of course, in 1921, they had to find the mountain. They followed the standard trade route up the Gama Valley, the Chumbi Valley between Bhutan and Sikkim, and then instead of going on to Lhasa, as Younghusband had, they turned west and followed the river to Shegarzong, the Shining Crystal Monastery, and there from Tingri they began to reconnoiter south. Now on this incredible expedition, they had to, of course, walk overland through the leech-infested forest of Sikkim, and eventually they found their way past these rivers. Here's Mallory skinny dipping in one of the rivers. And they found themselves on the Tibetan plateau in the shadow of this great fortress of Kampazong. And then a very interesting thing happened. Arthur Kellis, the high-altitude physiologist, 56 years old, too old for Everest, simply died of exhaustion. On the day of his burial, now I should just jump in with one slight digression. When I had this idea for this book, I signed a contract with Knopf in New York. It was the biggest book advance in the history of mountaineering literature. And then 3 months later, Mallory's body was found on Everest, and there were going to be 12 books out by fall. I offered to give all the money back, and the editor wonderfully said, we didn't give you all that money for a book on Mallory. We want a book by you on Mallory, and get on with it. And I flippantly said, well, it's going to take 10 years now. And I was really nervous as to what more could possibly be there to find, right? 12 books. And of course, then you discover that in the same way that Truman Capote said of Jack Kerouac, there's writing and there's typing, I would say there's research and there's Xeroxing. And all of these other books were just Xerox versions of other earlier stuff that were pretty superficial. But I didn't know that until something quite magical happened. I was in the White Museum in Banff, which is a marvelous museum if you don't know it, Museum of the Canadian Rockies. And of course, that's where the Wheeler family was from. Arthur Wheeler, founder of the Alpine Club of Canada. And an archivist there said to me, I think, Arthur's, Oliver Wheeler, who's the son of Arthur, who was on this expedition, the only Canadian, the full Canadian, besides Arthur Wakefield. He was 22. 21, there was one Canadian, Oliver Wheeler. And he said, I think John Wheeler, the son of Oliver, is still alive, living in Vancouver. Well, I made a beeline for West Vancouver and found John Wheeler, son of Oliver, living about 10 blocks from where I was born. And I went to see him, and according to all British historians, there was only one journal kept in 1921, a curt thing by Guy Bullock, published by the Alpine Club in 1962. And I went to see this incredibly beautiful man, John Wheeler, who sadly just passed away. He had his own legendary career with the Geological Survey of Canada. And in the middle of this sort of long interview, he suddenly pulled from his shelf 2 fat journals that his father had kept as he walked across Everest with Mallory in 1921. I was dumbstruck. I was breathless. I was too polite and Canadian to ask to borrow them. I kept scheming in my head, how am I going to get back here? And at the end of the interview, you know how that wonderful Canadian thing is like you suddenly get into the social thing and say, well, I climbed all these mountains that he had surveyed in northern BC, and my father had gone to Shawnigan Lake just before he had gone to Shawnigan Lake School. And as I left the house, I kept thinking, how am I going to get back here? And suddenly Mr. Wheeler just handed me these 2 journals and said, Wade, I think these will help you. And I kept those journals for 12 years, and not once did the family ever ask me what became of the project. But not only did I know the journals would be incredible in terms of their content, but of course they told me that if the British historians had not found these, they hadn't found anything, which actually is how it turned out to be the case. But here's where it gets interesting. Here is Kellis was buried right here in the shadow of mountains that he had been the first to climb. But here's our man, Oliver Wheeler. Now Oliver Wheeler would spend more time higher on the mountain, exposed to the wrath of the mountain, than any of the British in 1921. It would be him, not George Mallory, who found the key to the mountain, the route up the East Rongbuk Glacier. That was discovered by a Canadian, and that's the route that climbers from the north follow to this day. Whereas Henry Morshead was to map the geography on the approach to the mountain, his job was to use a new phototopographical survey technique that his father had invented in the Canadian Rockies to actually map the inner massif of the mountain. Now, on the day that Arthur Kellis died, the entry in his journal reads, well, they buried the old boy in the morning. Thought it would be the afternoon. Terribly sorry to have missed it, but I do hate funerals. Well, how do you miss the internment of one of the 6 men that you're walking across Tibet with? I knew the answer lay on the Western Front. Oliver Wheeler was a soldier. He graduated from RMC, the highest ranked cadet in the history of our military institution. He went off to India and served in the 7th Merit Division of the Indian Army. He was a Royal Engineer, and at the outbreak of hostilities, the Indian Army came right back to France. By November, the British Expeditionary Force had been annihilated. The topography of Armageddon was in place. The trench lines ran from Switzerland to the English border, and the entire British front was held by the Canadians in the north and the Indian Army in the south. And by this point, both sides were beginning to sap each other, trenches perpendicular to the main trench line, and it came to the attention of his command, he was a lieutenant, that the Germans had put a sap within 30 feet of their front line, 2 saps in fact, and he was given the order of going over the top and not only pushing the Germans over the top and burying the sap, and doing so in a way that the Germans would never try that again. He goes over the top. It turns out that the saps are full of Germans about to attack them. The result is a melee of hand-to-hand combat, ferocious in its intensity. Eventually, the Indians push the Germans back, but not before the sap is filled, 2 bodies deep, chest to chest, of dying boys of both sides, flailing about, as he wrote in his diary, like trout in my krail. And he had no choice but, as a Royal Engineer, to bury them all alive. So when he says on Everest, I do hate funerals, that's what we're talking about. Now, when he missed that burial, the fascinating thing is no one on the expedition, in their letters or in their own reports or their journals, criticized Wheeler for missing the interment of Kellis. Now, that seems crazy to us. I mean, inconceivable on a modern expedition. But the whole point is that for these men, the war had changed the very gestalt of death. In the trenches, they lived it every moment, and some, like Wheeler, for years. By the time Wheeler was 28, he had witnessed the death of hundreds of people. He encountered the shattered bodies of many thousands. Death's power lies in fear, which flourishes in the imagination and the unknown. For Wheeler, there was nothing more that death could show him short of his own. And with death looming at all times, every man in the trenches was granted license to deal with it as he saw fit. And if there was any decency to be found in the trenches, it was in the private sphere of dignity, respected by all, that each soldier cultivated within himself as he anticipated his own end and that of his friends and brothers. No one ever intruded into that space, just as no one on this expedition would have possibly dared to sanction Wheeler for what he did or did not do on the morning of Kellis's burial. And so here's the expedition on Everest, a little bit more rough and ready. And the challenge was, the critical thing is these were ridge walkers. Front-pointed crampons did not exist. They had to find a ridge that would get to a ridge that would get to the summit. They very quickly, as Mallory explored the Rongbuk Glacier, he came up and he saw this North Pole, what became the saddle of their desires. And they found that it was impossible to climb the North Pole from this side. So the whole quest in 21 was, how do we get around here to see if it's climbable from over here? Because if you got onto the summit of the col, you would be higher than any human had ever been. But it led to the northeast ridge, the northeast shoulder, and the summit pyramid of Everest. Now this is critical, because Mallory goes up here and explores all of this. But his mission is to explore everything here, and twice, 3 times, he misses this. And he escapes without having discovered the East Rongbuk Glacier. Wheeler, the surveyor, never makes a mistake. He's the one who found this opening and came up here and found the North Col. Well, here they are at Rongbuk, a monastery that was built based on the wealth created by potato agriculture introduced by the British in Nepal in 1870, the north face of Everest. That's the Rongbuk Glacier that Mallory walked up. Zatu Rinpoche, who they would seek his blessings during the course of the expedition. Eventually, they move around to the east of the mountain to a place called Petenringbo, where they camped on ground higher than anything in North America and looked up at the Kanchung face of Everest, 2 vertical miles of ice rising to the North Pole. Eventually, they made their way up the Karta Glacier to a place they called Windy Gap, known to the Tibetans as Lakbala, and finally, they could look across the head of the East Rongbuk Glacier to the North Pole, the pole of their desires. Mallory took this photograph. On the day he took that photograph, he wrote his beloved wife, Ruth, and lied to her twice in one letter. He said, if only we knew where this glacier ended up, we'd have an easier route to the mountain. But he did know, because Wheeler's sketch map of 2 weeks before had revealed both to Howard Bury and to the entire expedition. Mallory hated Canadians. I don't know how you hated Canadian, but Mallory hated Canadians. But that said, when it came time to climb down onto the head of the East Rongbuk, cross this ice field, climb up to 23,000 feet, reaching higher than any human in history, who is the one man on the team he takes? Oliver Wheeler. And they crest the North Pole. They're met by a wind unlike anything they've ever seen. They think they're going to die, and Wheeler writes that the only way we survived was by remembering how we survived shell fire in the Western Front, by breathing through the concussive explosions of the shells, by breathing between the gusts of the wind. They reached up to 23,000 feet. They couldn't go higher. They came back down, and Wheeler was on his deathbed. His legs were frozen, and in this beautiful moment of the coming together of those two men, George Mallory would stay up all night rubbing Wheeler's legs with whale oil, which kept him alive and kept his legs. And so they came back together. But at any rate, now we're 1922. They've got the route to the mountain, should be a piece of cake. It's a pure climbing expedition. The personnel have changed somewhat. This is John Morris, who was a delicate man from Nottingham. He escaped the trenches where he'd become a great trench killer by joining the Indian Army. A month before he joined the expedition in 1922 in Darjeeling, his command on the northwest frontier was ambushed. Many of his men were killed. He escaped to the balustrade of a fort and looked out into the setting sun to see one of his men coming at him, stumbling out of the sunset, his body completely flayed alive, his testicles hanging from sinew from his knees. This is the kind of world these men knew. And then he finds himself suddenly in the Everest Hotel when this great bear of a man comes blasting through his door, almost taking the door off its hinges. And this is General Bruce, the expedition leader for 1922, known to his men as the Mad Mountain Maniac. At Harrow, he had set a record for being thrashed more times in a shorter period of time than anyone in the 1,000-year history of the school. He had been expelled for throwing a pot of geraniums from the tower of the school onto the head of a highly respected lawyer who was on the board. His casual exercise in India was to run up and down the Khyber Pass with one of his adjutants on his back. His favorite party trick was to tear a pack of cards in half. There was not a wife of any man in his regiment that he had not slept with. At Gallipoli, he had his legs virtually sliced from his body by machine gun fire. He went home to convalesce in Britain. The doctor said, whatever you do, never walk up stairs or walk up any of the hills around here. But they said nothing about Everest. The story of 1922 is really the story of oxygen and the triumph, finally, of George Finch, who does join the expedition. There was this chasm between the administrators back in London who had never climbed anything higher than their desks, who thought that oxygen was unsporting, and the scientific men on the expedition, like Finch, the chemist, or Somerville, the doctor, thought that using supplemental oxygen was no different than finding the best pair of boots. So in 1922, the expedition is incredibly well equipped. We have George Finch, we have John Morris, we have the incredible Colonel Norton. Here's Finch, here's Henry Moorehead, Jeffrey Bruce, the general, Mallory. I mean, we've got the best team, Wakefield, Somerville, and so on. Incredible, incredible team, and it should be a piece of cake, but of course it wasn't. They pounded the way against the mountain. Their first attempt failed. Here they are at the base of the North Col. Their first attempt failed. Then critically, the 2IC Colonel Strutt foolishly authorized Mallory to take 3 of the climbers, Mooreshead, Norton, and Somerville, on this desperate attempt. They didn't realize yet that there were no second efforts on Everest. They nearly all died. Only a heroic self-arrest by Mallory saved their lives. But they came back, as you can see, severely frostbit. Mooreshead would lose fingers, Norton a part of his ear, Mallory himself. And the critical thing is that this exhausted all the climbers and left George Finch, who had been suffering from dysentery but recovered, with no one to climb with. But Finch was not about to be deterred. He had invented the down jacket for this expedition. He had invented the oxygen apparatus. So he recruited to his colors Jeffrey Bruce, the cousin of the general, the transport officer, who had never been on a mountain in his life. And yet the two of them, using oxygen, got both higher on the mountain and much closer to the mountain than Norton and Somerville had managed to do. And had it not been for Finch saving the life of Jeffrey Bruce, he might well have reached the top of Everest in 1922. And Mallory, furious that Finch had broken his height record within a week of it having been established, insisted on a third effort despite the snow conditions. And within an hour of this photograph being taken, an avalanche would sweep the last 7 men in that line to their deaths. And so a somber party retreats to England and comes back in 1924. New men on the expedition, Noel Odell and the incredible monster of a man, Sandy Irvine, an Oxford Blue, an incredible 21-year-old athlete. Now, the inclusion of Sandy, particularly on the final and fateful climb, has always provoked controversy. It's often been said that he had no experience on a mountain. There's even the prurient notion that some historians have raised that Mallory had sexual designs on the young man, which is a complete misunderstanding of both Mallory's sexuality and Irvine's libido. It's true that before the war, Mallory was part of the experimental bohemian scene at Cambridge, a time when men were experimenting sexually. John Maynard Keynes, the father of modern economics, was known at Cambridge as the iron copulating machine. Sexual experimentation was part of that incredible post-Edwardian scene that, again, was an ideal that was crushed in France. But by the time Mallory met Irvine, he was 38 years old, happily married, a father of 3 children, and Sandy was wildly and devilishly heterosexual. I could not find any one of his friends at Cambridge who had a mother that Sandy hadn't slept with. And if Mallory was drawn to this young Sandy Irvine, it was for very, very different reasons. Here they are from the Pangla looking across to Everest. First of all, Sandy was a mechanical savant. He probably had dyslexia, but as a 15-year-old boy, he had sent a design to the War Office for a gyroscopic gear that allowed a machine gun to fire through a propeller. He was an absolute mechanical genius. And if these men loved him so much, it's not because they had designs on him. It was because Sandy, having been born in 1902, had escaped the war. He wasn't untouched by the war. His cousin Edward had been killed in France. His brother Hugh had been splattered with mustard gas, wounds that would never heal, wounds that would have to be changed, the battle dressings, the rest of his life until he finally died in 1965. But Odell and Norton had both lost brothers at the front. Somerville had struggled through the dying boys at the Somme. They had all been witnesses to the carnage. And if they were powerfully drawn to young Sandy, it was because in some small way he embodied in his vitality, innocence, the limitless possibilities, which were the very reason they had all fought, and the future for which so many of their friends had died. And so in 1924, the big problem here was snow. and that's a key to the mystery. Snow had pounded the mountain. We now know that there was, in fact, a low-pressure system over the entire Himalaya that year that resulted in historic levels of snowfall. So not just once, but twice, they were pounded back from the North Pole. They gathered at the Rongbuk Monastery to be blessed by the Lama, and they went back for a final effort. And here you see a photograph taken by Somerville of Colonel Norton approaching the couloir that bears his name. He then foolishly had failed to use his snow goggles. He suffered from snow blindness. Somerville had to lead him by the hand down from 28,000 feet. And then as Norton was able to stumble ahead across the yellow band and down toward the Camp 4, suddenly Somerville himself could not breathe. And he was a doctor, so he pounded his chest and he coughed up the entire frozen lining of his throat. And like a woman who's given birth to her placenta with blood dripping from his mouth, he simply continued to walk down the mountain. That's the kind of men these characters were. And finally, with Norton completely hors de combat from the snow blindness, with Mallory, a man possessed, Mallory insisted on the final effort. And here they are. We know from a discovery of an oxygen bottle they got at least the first step. This is an easy route, say the exposure and the weather, with two impediments. The first step can be turned. The second step is a real impediment. A 120-foot vertical piece of rock that cannot be turned. So the question is, what became of Mallory? Well, certainly once Noel Odell reported their disappearance, Norton was not about to remain on the mountain. On June 16th, he abandoned Rongbuk, writing in his journal, "We were a sad little party, but from the first we accepted the loss of our comrades in that rational spirit which all of our generation had learnt in the Great War. But the tragedy was very near, as so constantly in the war, here in our mimic campaign, death had taken his toll from the best." And that night, as they marched away from the mountain, one of them looked out from the flaps of his tent and spoke for the entire adventure when he said, "I could see the whole of the historic ground, the scene of the protracted adventure, spread out like a map and bathed in full moonlight." And this is what's important. That night, and with that scene in front of one, it was quite easy to realize that the price of life is death, and that so long as the payment be made promptly, it matters little to the individual when the payment is made. Somewhere up there, in that vast wilderness of ice and rock, were two still forms. Yesterday, with all the vigor and will of perfect manhood, they were playing a great game, their life's desire. Today it is over, and they are gone, without their ever knowing the beginning of decay. Could any man desire a better end? Well, of course, the question for everybody is, did Mallory make it to the top before he died? Well, the answer is most likely no. First, there's the question of equipment. They didn't have crampons. They couldn't wear. They had crampons, not front-pointing crampons. They couldn't wear them at high elevation. Their ropes were too short and too weak to down belay the second step. They had left their high camp, leaving their flashlight in the tent, possibly suggesting that they climb by daylight when modern climbers leave at 9 o'clock in the morning and don't get back until 2 o'clock the following day. Their oxygen apparatus was heavy and clumsy. Irvin was suffering from severe burn. None of them they were both severely dehydrated. They had lost their stove and were unable to melt water. All these lines of evidence suggest that they did not make they could not have overcome the impediments on that ridge. However, there is one glorious possibility. Had the snow that pounded the northeast face that season, forcing them to turn back not once but 3 times from the base of the North Col and from the Camp 4 on above the col, Had that snow accumulated on the northeast ridge, as it would indeed do in the fall of 1986, it's quite possible that a ramp of snow would have been created that would have eliminated the hazard and the impediment of the second step, allowing Mallory and Irvin to simply walk up that ramp with the very speed that Noah Odell famously reported in his last ocular observation of the expedition. Perhaps that happened, we don't know, but had that happened, nothing would have kept Mallory from getting to the top. Because for all of these men, they would have walked on even to their end. Because for Mallory and all of his generation, death was a different thing. Death was but a frail barrier, as Billy Grenville wrote to his father from the Western Front, trying to explain what all of them were enduring. He said, "Daddy, death is but a frail barrier out here that men cross smiling and gallant every day." All of this generation, and of course Billy would die, as did his brother Julian, but all of this generation had seen so much of death that life mattered less than the moments of being alive. And in the end, for all of us, it really doesn't matter if George Mallory reached the top of Everest. He clearly reached higher on the mountain than any human being would do for 40 years. And especially in the wake of that event and in recognition of this, the centenary of the war, it's important to us, for all of us, to remember just what kind of remarkable men these climbers were. These were men of decency, honor, discretion, and decorum, so confident in their masculinity that they could speak of love between men without shame, collect butterflies in the dawn, paint watercolors before lunch, discuss Keats and Shelley and Shakespeare over lunch, and still be prepared to assault the flanks of Everest or indeed the German front lines by dusk. There are men the likes of which we will never know again, and yet when you think about it, these men were our grandfathers, and that's something we should never forget. And I just want to finish with a few comments that sort of came out of a little research we did here in the archive on Bowen. You know, in 1914, Canada had a population of 7 million. There were only 4 cities with populations more than 100,000. And yet, incredibly, over 600,000 men served in that war. 424,000 went overseas. Of the men who went overseas, 61,000 would die, 174,000 would be wounded. Over half of the Canadians who went to France became casualties, and 1 in 10 died, including 5 from this small island called Bowen. They were aged 18 to 40. That memorial down in Snug Cove was dedicated on June 14th, 1937, when Colonel Spencer and his Spencer's remnants, the 100 men who had survived his regiment, when they planted conifers in each corner of the monument. The monument itself was built from a form somehow made from an army cot by a fellow called William Linklater, who was the uncle of Cameron Smith, who at 40 was the oldest of the Bowen boys to die, a real estate agent, if you can imagine that, way back when. On April 30th, 1915, one of the boys who died, Charles Redmond, well, maybe it was Redmond who was a real estate agent. I'll take that back. I think it was Redmond who was a... Anyway, his mother received a letter from her son, and listen to this. "Dear mother, you will know that I came through, for I have cabled. The Germans broke through, and we charged them, and done them out of the trench and through the woods, holding them there all day and most of the night. How anyone came out of it is a miracle. The gunfight was awful. They attacked us on our right, and the 48th and the 5th Royals held them back. The whole Canadian division was in action, and we held them until the British came up. The 10th Canadian Battalion fired its last shots, point blank, at the Germans before they retired. The battle lasted a week and is still going on, but not so vigorously. They say that this was the worst battle of the war. Anyway, I don't want to see another one like it." Well, he wouldn't, because that attack was the attack of the Germans with chlorine gas. And that attack left 4 miles of defenses abandoned, allowing the Germans to advance through to a place called Kitchener's Woods. And on 11:30 p.m. on April 24th, 2 days after that attack by the Germans, 1,500 Canadians, the 10th Battalion of Alberta and the 16th Canadian Scottish Battalion from British Columbia, were ordered to retake that area. And they did, but by dawn only 500 men survived. And so Charles died in that attack, and so did this obscure figure called Lewin Tugwell of the 7th Battalion. Now, he was presumed missing April 24th. He died of his wounds on May 15th. We know that he was born in Oxford, and he was the son of a rector, but we have no sense of what his actual connection was to Bowen, though his name does appear on our cenotaph. And then the next to die would be Cameron Linklater Smith, a young man who had moved to the island with his parents, Herbert and Margaret, in 1901. He was the only son, the third oldest of 6 children. And, you know, I'm reminded of that incredible movie, Gallipoli, because Cameron was one of British Columbia's greatest long-distance runners. He was a superb athlete. And, of course, he was killed in action on April 9th of 1917 at Vimy Ridge. Now, those of you who have heard of Vimy may not really understand how significant that was. You know, in the wake of the German attack in April of 1915 at Ypres, but also at the Battle of Loos in September of 1915, Arras and the Somme, and eventually Vimy Ridge, of course. By 1917, well before Vimy Ridge, the biggest problem of the British High Command, quite literally, and this is not jingoistic cant, was to mask the whereabouts of the Canadian Corps. We began the war with 1 division. By Vimy Ridge, we were 4 divisions, a single corps under the command of Sir Arthur Currie, who fought together in that battle for the first time. The Germans knew if the Canadians were in their frontage, an attack was coming. This is not jingoistic cant. And in fact, it wasn't just Vimy, although Vimy was extraordinary. The French had lost 150,000 wounded and dead in 1915 trying to take that height of land. The British lost 50,000 in 1916, having failed to take it in battles that lasted for weeks. The Canadians, the 4 divisions fighting as a single corps, attacked at 5:30 a.m. on April 9th of 1917. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Canadian divisions achieved their goal on the first day. The 4th Canadian Division captured Hill 145 the following day, and within 3 days, the Canadians had taken a dramatic geographical feature that had defied the French and the British for 3 years. We suffered 10,602 casualties, which seems like a lot, and it was, but it was trivial compared to the carnage of battles directed by the British. But amongst the dead on that battle on April 9th was Cameron Linklater Smith, age 29. And also Norman Vickery. We don't know what happened to him because he's one of the 11,285 names of Canadian soldiers inscribed at the base of Vimy Ridge who were simply listed as missing and presumed dead, no doubt shattered by a shell. And of course, Norman had run the general store on Bowen before he went off to war. So it's a haunting thing to think that a small island like Bowen sent off 5 boys who would die in that war. And it's something we just always remember, particularly on the eve of Remembrance Day, that, you know, my grandfather fought in the First War, my father fought in the Second War. Both men had their lives profoundly affected by those engagements, those experiences, and they both fought so that I would never have to fight, and that's something I never forget. Thank you very much.